I noticed I don't have a channel name. It says Nan, and no additional notes. I'll proceed with the other specs you gave. Male narrator, 55 plus, first person, American audience. Addressed by relationship terms like son, daughter, friend, since those are clear enough to write from. One quick flag, A to 5500, word script runs about 7 to 8 minutes of narration, not close to the original's 119-minute runtime. This will read as a tight short story, not a replica of that long-form pacing. I'm writing it as the best possible dense version of the same arc within that word count. I heard my daughter's name in his mouth like a piece of gum he wanted to spit out, and I set my coffee cup down so carefully it didn't even clink against the saucer. I'm Robert. I'm 61 years old, and for the last 11 years, since my wife Carol passed, it's been me and my daughter Emma against whatever the world wanted to throw at us. Emma is 29. She restores old houses for a living, the kind of work where you can see exactly what someone poured their heart into decades ago, buried under water damage and bad wallpaper. She has her mother's patience and her mother's stubborn hope that people are basically good. I love that about her. I also worry about it every single day. The dinner was at a place called La Rousse, downtown, the kind of restaurant where the menu doesn't list prices and the waiter refills your water before you notice it's low. Emma's fiancé, Julian, had flown his family in from Lisbon to meet us properly before the wedding. His mother, Fatima, and his father, Duarte, sat across the table in clothes that looked expensive in a quiet way, the way real money usually looks. Julian had spent the better part of a year describing me to them, I found out later, as a retired handyman who fixed toilets for a living and probably didn't own a passport. I let him have that story. I wore my old blue blazer. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu even though I couldn't see the price, and I let Julian order $200 wine and talk with his hands about his investment fund in a way that made Emma's eyes shine with pride. What Julian never bothered to find out, because he never once asked me a real question about my life, was that I spent 19 years as a translator and later a station chief for an oil logistics company, most of it in Lisbon and Porto, negotiating shipping contracts in Portuguese with men who would have eaten Julian alive before the appetizers arrived. I speak Portuguese the way some men speak the language they were raised in, not fluent native. I never told Emma the details of that career, because after Carol got sick, all of that felt like a different lifetime that belonged to a different man. I became, simply, her father. Julian looked at a quiet older man in a discount blazer and saw nothing. That was his first mistake. Halfway through the entrees, Emma excused herself for the restroom. The second her chair scraped back and she was out of earshot, something in the air at that table changed, the way a room changes right before a storm breaks. Fatima leaned toward Duarte and Julian, and the polite, halting English they'd been performing all evening dissolved into fast, low Portuguese. They smiled at me while they did it, nodded at me warmly, the way you'd nod at a dog that couldn't understand you was being talked about. Fatima said, with a small laugh, that Emma was a sweet little tool, useful and uncomplicated, exactly what Julian needed right now. Duarte chuckled into his wine and said her American naivety would make the paperwork easy. And then Julian, my daughter's fiancé, the man who had asked me for her hand 2 months ago, with tears actually standing in his eyes, leaned in and told his parents, in his own language, that they only had to keep smiling a little longer. Once he had her name on the partnership documents next month, he said, he'd start easing the old handyman out of the picture entirely. Painless, gradual. She'd barely notice. I chewed my steak. I looked at my plate. I did not move a single muscle in my face. When Emma came back, glowing, and the check arrived, Julian did his practiced little pantomime of patting his jacket pockets, looking stricken, mouthing an apology. I reached over and took the leather folder before he finished the performance. I looked at Duarte, then Fatima, then Julian, and I said, in Portuguese so clean it could have come out of a Lisbon boardroom, don't worry about it. The handyman has it covered. Enjoy your little tool. Then I stood, kissed my daughter on the top of her head, and walked out into the night. Emma caught me at the valet stand, furious, her heels striking the pavement like gunfire. Dad, what is wrong with you? What did you just say to them? I tried to explain gently, carefully, that I understood every word they'd said, that it was ugly, that Julian had called her a tool and promised his parents he'd cut me out. But before I finished the sentence, the restaurant doors flew open and Julian came sprinting out into the cold, face pale, hands raised like a man surrendering to police. He wrapped his arm around Emma before I could get another word out. "It's a misunderstanding, darling. Your father's Portuguese is old, rusty, from decades ago. My mother used an old expression, ferramenta preciosa. It means precious instrument, like someone essential, someone who makes everything work." It was a compliment. He said it so smoothly, I almost believed I'd imagined the whole thing myself. I told Emma he was lying. I told her I'd negotiated million-dollar contracts in that language for 2 decades, and I knew exactly what sweet little tool meant, and it wasn't a compliment. But Julian was already crying real, glistening tears, telling her how hard he'd tried to impress her father, how his parents flew 4,000 miles to be humiliated at a public dinner, how he knew I'd never really accepted him because he wasn't from here. He said Carol would be disappointed in the paranoid old man I'd become. That one landed like a fist in my chest. Emma looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's done something unforgivable. "You will not walk me down the aisle until you apologize to his family," she said, and got into Julian's car. And I stood alone on that curb, feeling like I'd lost the only thing I had left in the world. But I did not chase her. I did not call her that night or the next. 22 years of negotiating with men who lied for a living had taught me one unbreakable rule. When your opponent controls the story, you do not fight the story, you change the battlefield entirely. So I let Julian believe he'd won. I texted Emma the next morning, short and defeated, saying I was sorry, that I was an old man set in his ways who didn't understand modern manners, that I'd give her space until she was ready to talk. It was the hardest lie I have ever typed with my thumbs. It felt like handing my daughter over to a wolf and smiling while I did it. 4 days of silence followed. I scrubbed my kitchen top to bottom just to keep my hands busy while my mind worked. And on the 4th day, moving a stack of unopened mail off the counter, I found a thick cream-colored envelope wedged behind the toaster, the same heavy paper stock Julian had waved around my kitchen weeks earlier, boasting about letters of intent from investors backing his real estate fund in Porto. He'd left this one behind by accident the day he and Emma rushed out to catch a movie, and I hadn't thought twice about it until now. I put on my reading glasses. The letterhead wasn't from any investment fund. It was from a commercial bank in Lisbon, one I recognized instantly from my old career, a bank known throughout the shipping industry for being merciless about defaults. The words at the top, in bold red, weren't letter of intent. They read Notificação Final de Cobrança, Final Collection Notice. My hands went cold reading it. It cited fraudulent collateral, falsified income statements, missed court summons, and a demand for immediate repayment of just over 380,000 euros, with a warning that the file would be referred to prosecutors if unpaid by the end of the month. The deadline sat exactly 16 days out. 3 days after Emma and Julian's wedding, the math hit me like a physical blow. Julian wasn't rushing this wedding because he was desperately in love. He was rushing it because the walls in Lisbon were closing in, and he needed cash before they did. I photographed every inch of that document, locked the original in my home safe, and called a number I hadn't dialed in 6 years. Denise Okafor, the most ruthless attorney I ever worked alongside in 22 years of corporate fights. She didn't say hello. She said, "Robert, tell me someone finally did something worth suing over." When I told her it involved Emma, her voice changed completely. "My office." 20 minutes. Denise read the Lisbon document without needing translation. She'd worked international fraud cases for 15 years. "This isn't a business partner," she said, tossing it onto her desk. "This is a man running from prosecution." I told her what I'd overheard at the restaurant, what Julian had promised his parents. She called her investigator in Lisbon that same afternoon, a retired financial crimes detective named Tomas, who owed her more favors than either of them could count. "I want everything," she told him. "Bank records, court filings, who he sleeps next to at night. You have 2 weeks. But it was Denise who asked the question that truly broke the case open. "Robert, your daughter's a successful contractor, but she's not sitting on 400,000 euros. What does she have access to, right around the wedding date, that she doesn't have access to right now?" And I understood, all at once, with my stomach dropping through the floor. Carol. My late wife had spent her final 8 months, after her diagnosis, quietly building an irrevocable trust for Emma, every dollar of her retirement, her life insurance payout, Everything she could liquidate without me even fully realizing what she was doing. $600,000, sitting untouched, waiting. Carol had built one condition into the trust, a safeguard against exactly the kind of predator we now had circling our family. The funds released automatically on Emma's 30th birthday, or on her wedding day, whichever came first. Emma turns 30 on November the 20th. The wedding, which Julian had pushed relentlessly to move up, citing his ailing grandmother in Porto, who supposedly couldn't travel later in the year, was scheduled for November the 6th, 2 weeks early. Just enough to shift the trust from Emma's separate premarital property into shared marital property. The instant the vows were spoken, money he could legally touch, drain, and wire straight to Lisbon before anyone in our family understood what had happened. Denise's investigator called 4 days later with the rest of it. There was no real estate fund. Julian had worked as a junior loan officer at a regional bank outside Lisbon, where over 3 years he'd quietly diverted client funds into shell accounts under his cousin's name, nearly 1.8 million euros, before an internal audit caught the pattern. He'd fled to the United States on a tourist visa the week before charges were filed. His parents, we learned from bankruptcy filings Tomas dug up, owned a struggling textile business that Julian had been funneling stolen money into for years. They knew exactly where the money came from, and they'd flown to America not to celebrate a wedding, but to wait out their own looming lawsuits while their son secured a bailout. And then Denise opened the third folder, the one she warned me to sit down for. Photographs. Julian standing in a plaza in Porto, arm around a young woman named Sophia, an engagement ring catching the sun on her hand. They'd been engaged for over a year. Emails recovered from a secondary account showed Julian telling Sophia he was in America closing an investment deal and would return within months with enough capital to start their real life together. He had never intended to stay married to my daughter. The plan was simple and monstrous. Drain the trust, pay off Lisbon, quietly divorce Emma within a year, and bring Sophia to the States on the residency status he'd have secured through the marriage. Denise wanted to call the FBI immediately. I told her no. If Julian was arrested now, he'd spin it from a holding cell, a jealous father, a corporate setup, a misunderstanding, and Emma, still half under his spell, might believe him rather than lose the fairy tale entirely. I needed her to see the mask come off with her own eyes. So I told Denise my plan, and her smile, for the first time in years, looked genuinely dangerous. I called Julian and asked him to come to my house alone. Told him, voice trembling, that I couldn't bear the silence with Emma anymore, and I was ready to make peace. He agreed instantly, predators always do, when they think the wounded animal is finally crawling back. I staged my study like a grieving old widower's sanctuary. Dim light, Carol's photograph front and center on my desk. My shoulders deliberately slumped when he walked in, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. I told him I was wrong to make a scene. I told him grief had made me paranoid, that losing Carol had made the thought of losing Emma unbearable, and that I wanted, more than anything, to make things right. His whole posture relaxed. He believed every word. Then I told him I knew about the money Emma planned to invest from her trust, and how it broke my heart to think of Carol's final gift being risked on a startup. I told him I had savings of my own $600,000, quietly built over 2 decades overseas, and I wanted to give it to him instead, so Emma's trust would never have to be touched. His eyes went wide and hungry in a way he couldn't hide. I watched him do the math in real time. My money now meant he didn't need to wait for the wedding at all, didn't need to risk Emma asking questions, could pay off Lisbon immediately. He agreed on the spot, with one condition of his own total secrecy from Emma. I told him I needed one thing in return, a proper legal contract, because I was old-fashioned about money drawn up by my lawyer. He never asked who my lawyer was. Denise buried 2 clauses inside that contract, hidden behind pages of boring, reassuring investment language. The first was a federal financial disclosure clause. By signing, Julian was certifying, under penalty of perjury, that he had no outstanding foreign criminal liabilities. The second was an ironclad waiver, permanently severing any claim he could ever make to Emma's trust, wedding or no wedding, forever. He signed every page in Denise's downtown office without so much as a question, without hiring a lawyer of his own, initialing his own confession with a flourish, and as he handed the folder back to me, he muttered under his breath in Portuguese, thinking no one else in the room understood him, calling me a pathetic old dog who'd handed over his own bones. I smiled at him, a real smile. He had no idea what he'd just done. The rehearsal dinner was held in a private room at a hotel downtown. 40 guests under warm gold light, Julian holding court at the head of the table about his fictional real estate empire, while his parents charmed the room with rehearsed European elegance. I sat quietly at the far end, watching, waiting. When it came time for the father of the bride to speak, I stood slowly and carried a dark leather folder to the head of the table instead of a champagne glass. Emma looked up at me, expecting a toast. I told her that her mother had spent her last months on this earth building a shield around her, and that real love never asks you to hide things in the dark. Then I opened the folder and slid it in front of her. She saw the Lisbon collection notice first, then the photograph of Julian and Sophia, then the translated blank power of attorney form he tried to get her to sign the week before, disguised as immigration paperwork. I watched her face come apart in real time. Julian shot up, shouting that it was fabricated, that I hated him because he wasn't American, that I'd hired someone to frame him. His parents scrambled to their feet, Duarte demanding the hotel call security to remove me. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up the collection notice and read it aloud, slowly, in flawless Portuguese, and watched the color drain completely from all three of their faces as they realized, at last, that I had understood every word they'd ever said in front of me. That was when Denise walked in, navy suit, silver briefcase, heels striking the marble floor like a countdown. She introduced herself as counsel and informed Julian, in front of all 40 guests, that the contract he'd signed constituted federal perjury, that his visa had already been flagged, and that the promised $600,000 had never actually been transferred, $0, pending a background check he would never pass. Julian's parents sat frozen, their entire European elegance collapsing into panic. Emma stood up, looked at the man she'd nearly married, and said only, "Get out." He reached for her hand one last time, begging, and she stepped back and let him fall. Within 3 weeks, federal agents detained Julian on visa fraud charges, and Portugal's own extradition request sent him home in handcuffs to face the embezzlement case waiting for him there. His parents' business, without the bailout they'd been counting on, collapsed under their creditors within the month. Emma moved back into her childhood bedroom for a while. She cried behind closed doors more nights than I want to remember, not over losing Julian, but over how close she'd come to losing everything her mother had built for her without ever knowing it was at risk. One evening, packing away the unworn wedding dress, she finally broke down completely, and I sat on the floor beside her boxes and held her the way I did when she was 7 and had fallen off her bike. I never said I told you so. Not once. I told her instead that predators are dangerous precisely because they're skilled at wearing the faces of people worth trusting, and that her capacity to love openly was never the problem. It was one of the best things about her, and no one gets to turn it into a weakness. Now, most evenings, Emma and I sit on the back porch the way her mother and I used to, watching the sky go orange over the fence line, and it feels, for the first time in almost a year, like our family is actually whole again. She's taking a few months off to travel before diving back into her restoration work, rebuilding houses, and, I suspect, rebuilding herself alongside them. I've thought a lot since that dinner about what real strength actually looks like. It isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience or a title or a European accent to sound important. It watches, it waits. It lets arrogant people believe they're the smartest ones in the room, right up until the moment they aren't. Julian and his family mistook my silence for weakness, because that's the only frame they had for a quiet man. They never once considered that the quiet man had spent 2 decades learning exactly how people like them operate and exactly how they eventually destroy themselves. If there's one thing I'd ask anyone listening to take with them tonight, it's this. Don't mistake someone's calm for their capitulation. And if you love someone, love them enough to let the truth be slow and complete, even when every instinct in your body wants to scream it at them immediately. A truth handed to someone gently, with proof, is a truth they can actually hold on to. A truth shouted at them in anger is one they'll spend years finding reasons to doubt. I made a promise to my wife, 11 years ago, that I would keep our daughter safe for as long as I had breath to do it. I didn't need to raise my voice to keep that promise. I just needed to be patient and to remember that the quietest man at the table is very often the one who's been paying the closest attention all along.